All right, welcome back. And today we're going to take a look at aperture. And aperture is part of the exposure triangle that we've been looking into. Aperture is a function of the lens, not the actual camera body. So let's go ahead and move on over and take a look at the front of a lens. So we have a camera here. And before we go ahead and get directly into the aperture, which is referring to the size of opening that we have right here on this iris, let's go ahead and take a look at all the different numbers on the front of a lens just to go over those for a second time if we don't remember. Right here, the very first thing in millimeters, and it's always in millimeters, is the focal length of our lens. So this is a 50 millimeter focal length, and that is your standard lens. The next is your minimum aperture. So this minimum aperture is 1.8, which is what we call quite fast. It does let a lot of light into the camera. Usually anything 2.8 or lower is considered a fast lens, and anything f4 or higher is considered a slow lens. And that has to do with minimum aperture opening. Down here we have our filter or our lens cap size. So this number right here is telling you what size screw-in filter or lens cap would fit this lens. And right here is your aperture, and the aperture is written in a number called an f-stop. And a lot of people might call it an aperture of f4 or an f-stop of f4. Either way, we're going to understand what you're talking about. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next image. And right here we have two different lenses that look exactly the same, except for one has a fixed aperture and the other has a variable aperture. So let's go ahead and take a look at the fixed aperture first and what that means. So right here we have a 17 to 35 millimeter zoom lens. And if we come on over here, and this is written incorrectly, it should be 2.8, not 2-8. But what this means is the minimum aperture of this lens is 2.8 and it's fixed. So no matter where, when you're zooming, it's always going to have a minimum aperture of 2.8. Now you're going to have other apertures available, but the key is as you zoom, the aperture never changes. You pay for this. This is what a pro lens is going to give you. First of all, a fast lens, which is 2.8, and it's fixed. Now, a lot of you that have the kit lens in a new camera, you'll notice that most likely you have something like an 18 to 55 millimeter zoom lens, but you have what we call a variable aperture. And that's what we see here. We have the same 17 to 35 millimeter focal length. However, the minimum aperture in this lens is f4. This was 2.8. And as you zoom, it changes to 5.6. And what that means is at 17 millimeters, your minimum opening is going to be f4. But at 35 millimeters, your minimum opening is going to be 5.6. And as you zoom, those numbers are going to change. The problem with that is, as it changes, you have to compensate for the exposure loss. So as we go from 4 to 5, 6, we're losing a stop of light. And as we zoom, that number is going to change. So we're also going to have to change our shutter speed or our ISO to compensate for that loss of light, which is really a pain in the neck. I've only owned one of these lenses, and it was when I first started in photography. And just like everybody else, it's because that's what you can afford. So that's the main difference between a fixed and a variable lens. And an average price for a fixed lens zoom like this might be $2,000, and a variable lens like this, you might see anywhere from $200 to $400. So it's quite a difference in price. Now, that's not the only thing that goes into the difference in prices, but that's pretty typical of a price difference that we would see. So let's go ahead and take a look one more time in aperture. We have a fast aperture. Remember, I said anything 2.8 or lower is considered fast. 4 and up is going to be slow, and that's minimum aperture on your lens. The smaller the number, the more light the camera lets in. The smaller the opening, the less light the lens lets in. However, the number is larger. All right. So they're opposite of what you think. So small opening, large number, large opening, small number. This is usually what people get confused on when they're learning aperture. Remember, these numbers, which are whole stops, there are numbers in between it, are called f-stops. And as we remember, every function of the camera does two different things. One, it's controlling the amount of light that gets into the camera. And in this case, aperture also controls depth of field. When we let lots of light in and the lens opening is large, we have a shallow depth of field. As we move on up this way, as we get a smaller opening, we have a larger depth of field, meaning more is going to be in focus. Let's go ahead and take a look at some images to see what that looks like. And remember, a shallow depth of field uses a large aperture opening, but the f-stop number is small. So we have this picture of these little birds right here, and you can see it's right in focus just on the birds, but just about anything behind them or in front of them is completely out of focus. This is what we call a shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is going to have a very large opening or a small f-stop number like 1.8, 2.0. So it's going to be a large opening. An image like this where you have a subject and it just kind of goes off into the background is great because we can really explain what depth of field does. This image would have been shot with a very small aperture, meaning like something like f1.4, 1.8, 2.0, because we have just a teeny tiny bit of the area is in focus. This is a shallow depth of field. If we shot this to get a large depth of field, we would use a very high f-stop number like f22. And what you would see is a large area from here to here would all be in focus. But in this case, here's another great example. If you want to do a test, it's not always the most beneficial thing to take amazing photos. But if you can line something up like this, where you've got an object here and then one a little further back and one a little further back and one a little further back, these are great because they allow you to just set your camera and change your aperture. And as you change it, you'll see in an image like this will be in focus. And then you'll take another one where this and this will get in focus. And then if you increase your aperture again, maybe all three of these will get in focus. It's showing you a great example of how that aperture is working. So in this case, once again, we would have used a small f-stop, meaning a small number. It's letting a lot of light in, but it's only going to give us a little shallow depth of field because this is in focus and this one isn't in focus. So let's take a look at large depth of field. What is large depth of field? A large depth of field uses a small aperture opening, but a large f-stop number. Remember, it's the opposite of logic there. So let's go ahead and take a look at a large depth of field. So we can see here, it's not perfectly in focus, but basically the whole scene is in focus. So this is a large depth of field. If we would have shot this with a small f-stop, maybe this would have been in focus, but this back here would have been out of focus, and this up here would have been out of focus. In this case, we wanted everything to be in focus, so we're using a large f-stop, like f22. So let's take a look at this image. This is a good example of sort of a medium depth of field. It's not that everything is in focus. If you look at the boat here, this is totally sharp and in focus. But as we get back here to these buildings and these boats, they're a little bit soft. They're not totally out of focus, but they're a little soft. Now we have a little movement in the clouds, so those can throw you off a little bit. The back clouds seem to be pretty sharp or sharper than this. So this would tell me that these clouds are moving and we have sort of a long exposure. That's why we're getting this sort of glass look on the water. But yeah, in this case, it's not a super large depth of field, but it is sort of a medium depth of field. So what can we do to learn about aperture and how it affects our image? So we can practice photographing a subject and changing the aperture to see how it affects the depth of field. In this, I'm telling you a technical approach is a better option. And if you remember here in this image, this is what I'm talking about, where you're just having your camera and you have this line of objects going back. And if you just change your aperture, it's going to give you a really good representation as you increase that aperture of more and more of these objects becoming clear and more in focus. So this is where I get the do not move the camera and set up a series of objects. Watch as the depth of field increases or decreases depending on which way you're moving the aperture. I have an example here where it says see the image below. This would be another good example of an object or a scene to photograph to really give you a good idea of how depth of field's working. Here we have a whole bunch of chairs, and you'll look, it's not a really shallow depth of field, but it's not a large depth of field either because these are out of focus. But basically we have between here and here in focus. And what we would do is just focus on a spot. So let's say we're going to focus right here on number 8. And then you're not going to change and move your camera. You're not going to change your focus. All you're going to do is change that aperture. Start off on one extreme or the other. So your minimum, like f4, and then move on up to f22. And remember, each time that you make an adjustment with your aperture, you're going to have to change your shutter speed to get an equivalent exposure. The cool thing is if you're using a tripod and you put it on a timer, it doesn't matter how long your exposure is because the camera's not going to move. And so you can go all the way from f4 to f22. And what you'll see is each time you make an adjustment, more and more will get in focus. And then when you go back the other way, less and less will get in focus. And it will give you a good representation of aperture is affecting your image. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you, and we will look into this when we go into depth of field, but depth of field in itself is more than just aperture. It's a combination of 3 elements. 1 is aperture, 2 is distance to subject, and 3 is your focal length. Depending on which lens and how far you are away from your subject, it's all going to really play into that equation of how much depth of field you get. But in this case, aperture does affect depth of field, and this is going to be a really good example of something for you to try. Might not be the most exciting image to photograph, but it's going to help you understand what aperture does with your camera. Well, hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you have, it would be great if we could get a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below, and as always, don't forget to subscribe.